The emergency distress signal flickered through the void, a desperate whisper echoing across the infinite darkness. The transmission came from a Zarvok battleship, one of the most advanced war vessels in the galaxy. Yet, in its final moments, it was nothing more than a helpless, crumbling wreck floating in the abyss. "This is Commander Vraxis of the Zarvok Imperial Fleet." A voice crackled through the static, heavy with dread. "We made a mistake. We ventured too close. It knows we're here." The command center of the Galactic High Council was silent as the transmission played. A dozen alien species, each a master of war, trade, and diplomacy, listened in horror. They had seen planets burn. They had fought wars that lasted centuries. But this was something else. A violent static burst cut through the signal. Then the voice returned, lower now, shaking. "It's not an enemy. It's not a weapon. It's something worse. It doesn't attack. It doesn't invade. It watches. And the moment you see it, it sees you." A shrill, unnatural scream tore through the transmission. A deep hum followed, almost like a frequency beyond mortal comprehension, something ancient and infinite. Then, nothing. The signal cut out abruptly, leaving only an eerie silence in the chamber. The council chamber erupted into chaos. "The Zarvok are gone," one ambassador gasped. "No remains, no wreckage, not even dust," a security officer confirmed. "Their fleet was erased." "This has happened before," a high-ranking official of the Selvari Dominion muttered, his voice trembling. 1,000 years ago, a civilization vanished overnight. No war, no warning, no survivors. "The nightmare has returned," someone whispered. A decision was made instantly. A new law was passed. No ship, no scout, no drone would ever be allowed to approach the Forbidden Zone again. The sector was locked down, quarantined. It was not to be studied, not to be spoken of. No one wanted to risk attracting its attention. For the aliens, fear was their strongest survival instinct. But for humans, fear was just another obstacle to overcome. At the far end of the chamber, 2 human representatives sat quietly, watching the panic unfold. One of them, Captain Ross, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Beside him, a grizzled war veteran, Commander Bonner, studied the frightened faces of the galactic leaders. "They're scared," Ross murmured. "Terrified," Bonner corrected. He glanced at the frozen display of the last recorded image from the Zarvok battleship. It was nothing but darkness, a blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. But deep within it, something lurked. Something watching. "This thing," Ross said, tapping the screen, "it wipes out entire fleets without firing a shot. It doesn't even have to attack. Just the knowledge of its existence destroys people." "Because they let fear rule them," Bonner muttered. "They hide, they run. They obey rules made by cowards." Ross smirked. "Yeah, that's not really the human way, is it?" At that moment, the head of the Galactic Council stood. "All exploration near the Forbidden Zone is now illegal. Any ship that approaches will be considered lost." The decree was met with grim nods from every species present. Fear kept them in check. Fear was their weapon and their prison. Bonner turned to Ross and muttered under his breath, "What if we go anyway?" Ross chuckled. "You read my mind." Later that night, deep within the human-controlled sector of space, a secret meeting took place aboard the HSS Vengeance, a state-of-the-art stealth warship. The best minds in the Terran Military Division sat around a holographic projection of the Forbidden Zone. "We are the first species to ever make it this far in galactic history," a scientist explained. "Every other civilization feared the unknown. Humans, we've always run toward it." Ross nodded. "Exactly. We climbed mountains, dove into the deepest oceans, and even left our own planet before we fully understood space. Fear is nothing but a challenge waiting to be conquered." Bonner leaned forward. "The Council believes the nightmare can't be fought. What if they're wrong?" A murmur passed through the room. The Zarvok weren't weak. Their warships could obliterate planets, yet something erased them without effort. Ross cracked his knuckles. Then it's time we find out what we're really up against. Against every law, against every warning, the humans prepared a stealth mission into the heart of terror itself. As the HSS Vengeance slipped into the void, cloaked in shadows, its crew of explorers, soldiers, and scientists prepared for the unknown. They were about to become the first beings in history to confront the nightmare head-on. And for the first time, something in the dark would finally see humanity staring back. The HSS Vengeance drifted silently through the void, its cloaking systems humming at barely a whisper. Unlike the massive battleships of the Galactic Council, built for dominance and intimidation, the Vengeance was designed for something else: survival. Humanity didn't have the most powerful ships, the most advanced weapons, or the most impenetrable defenses, but they had something no other species did. They were unpredictable. Captain Ross stood on the bridge, staring at the endless darkness beyond the viewing screen. His fingers tapped against the console as he listened to the crew's reports. "We're now crossing the boundary into the Forbidden Zone," the pilot announced. "No turning back after this." "Good," Ross said. He glanced over his shoulder at Bonner, who leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. "No sign of movement," Bonner muttered, but there was an uneasiness in his voice. "Doesn't feel right." "Nothing about this is right," Ross replied. For centuries, alien civilizations had lived by strict, unbreakable rules. Never challenge what you don't understand. If something was too powerful, too unknown, or too dangerous, it was left alone. That was how the Galactic Council maintained order. It was how every species before them had survived. Humans had never followed those rules. That was why they had made it this far. Ross watched the sensor readouts carefully. No energy signatures, no movement, nothing to indicate they were not alone. But the silence itself felt wrong, like something waiting in the dark, unseen. "Any changes to the gravitational field?" Ross asked. The ship's AI, Athena, responded, her voice smooth and calm. "Negative, Captain. However, I am detecting minor irregularities in the surrounding space. It is as if something is observing us, but I cannot confirm its presence." Bonner exhaled sharply. "That's comforting." The bridge crew remained tense. They all knew what had happened to the Zarvok fleet. The most technologically advanced warriors in the galaxy had been erased without a trace. And yet here they were, humans, a species barely a few centuries into space travel, daring to do what no one else had. Because that was the difference. Other species feared the unknown. Humans explored it. The crew of the Vengeance wasn't made up of the strongest soldiers or the most brilliant scientists. They were survivors, veterans of battles against enemies stronger than them, thinkers who had solved problems without having the tools they needed. The Galactic Council had dismissed humans as reckless and impulsive. But recklessness wasn't stupidity. It was boldness in the face of the impossible. Bonner stepped forward, looking at the pilot. "How long until we reach the last known coordinates of the Zarvok fleet?" 2 minutes. Ross turned to the weapons officer. "Shields." "At full strength. But if this thing attacks the way it did before, I doubt they'll do much." "We won't win this fight with shields or weapons," Bonner muttered. "We need to be smarter." Ross nodded, then addressed the crew. "Listen up. Every species before us ran. They followed rules built on fear. But fear makes you predictable. That's why they lost. Whatever this thing is, we aren't going to fight it like they did. We're going to do what humans do best." The crew exchanged glances. "We adapt," Ross said. The moment the HSS Vengeance crossed into the last known location of the Zarvok fleet, the ship's instruments flickered violently. "Something's wrong," the pilot said. "The scanners." A sudden distortion rippled through space. The stars outside the viewing screen twisted and warped, as if reality itself was bending. Then the ship lurched violently. The entire bridge shuddered, and every screen flashed red. We're being pulled. Ross gripped the console. Engines at full reverse. Brake free. It's not working. Outside, the black void seemed to shift and move. Space itself was no longer behaving the way it should. It was like falling into a pit with no bottom. Then something moved. A shape, vast and unknowable, drifted through the darkness. Not a ship, not a structure. It was impossible to define. It was just there, watching, waiting. The crew felt it in their bones, in the very fabric of their existence. A presence older than time, a force that did not conquer or destroy in the way living beings understood. It simply erased. And it had seen them. Ross turned sharply to Athena. Are our systems compromised? Not yet, the AI responded, but there was something different in her voice, a hesitation, as if even she could feel the unnatural presence. But I recommend immediate evasive action. Bonner's fists clenched. We don't even know if this thing thinks like we do. Ross's mind raced. Every species before them had seen this thing as a force of nature, something unknowable, untouchable. But that wasn't how humans worked. If something existed, it had rules. If it had rules, it could be understood. And if it could be understood, it could be defeated. Ross's eyes narrowed. We're going to test something. The crew looked at him in shock. Test what? The pilot demanded. Ross turned toward Athena. Run a simulated randomized movement pattern. No logic, no prediction. Just pure chaos. Athena hesitated. That is, highly irregular. Exactly, Ross said. Do it. The ship suddenly jerked in random directions, spinning, twisting, moving in ways no normal vessel ever would. And in the darkness, the thing hesitated. Bonner's eyes widened. It stopped. The void was still shifting, still warping around them, but something had changed. The thing in the dark was no longer advancing. It's confused, Ross muttered. It doesn't know what we're doing. Realization dawned on Bonner's face. That's why the others lost. They followed a pattern. They were predictable. Ross's mind raced. This thing doesn't just erase civilizations. It erases order, structure. It thrives on things it can predict. Bonner grinned. But humans, we don't follow patterns. We break them. For the first time since entering the Forbidden Zone, the crew of the HSS Vengeance had hope. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the most advanced. But they were different. And in that difference, they had found their greatest weapon. Ross's eyes locked onto the shifting mass of darkness ahead. Let's see how this thing handles chaos. The first battle between humanity and the nightmare had just begun. The HSS Vengeance drifted in the endless void, surrounded by a darkness deeper than anything the crew had ever known. The ship's sensors flickered uselessly, failing to comprehend the thing that loomed in the abyss. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was an absence of reality itself. A void where physics broke down, where time itself seemed uncertain. Captain Ross gripped the edge of his console, eyes locked on the shifting mass outside. It had no shape, no form his mind could define. It was there, yet not. Moving, yet still. Looking at it felt like staring into something that should not exist. The bridge was silent except for the low hum of the ship's systems. The crew barely breathed. Even Bonner, the hardened war veteran, sat rigid, his fingers hovering over his sidearm, as if a gun would make any difference against something like this. Then it moved. Not in a way the human brain could process. There was no clear motion, no sound. It was as if one moment it was distant, and the next, it was inches away. The ship's lights flickered violently. The screens turned to static. The deep pressure settled in the air, like the weight of a dying star pressing against their chests. Then a sound, faint at first, a whisper, but not made of words. A presence, something inside their minds. The crew members flinched as their thoughts were not their own anymore. Images flashed, memories, fears, moments of their lives twisted into something unfamiliar. Ross saw his childhood home, but the sky was wrong. the ground endless, the house melting into the horizon. Bonner gasped, stumbling back. What the hell is? The whisper grew louder. Not words. Understanding. The thing was not communicating. It was searching. Studying. It had seen thousands of species. It had unmade them all. It had no name, no purpose. It was just there, consuming order, breaking reality, reducing civilizations to nothing without ever firing a weapon. But now something was wrong. It did not understand humans. Ross clenched his jaw. He could feel it probing, looking for the familiar patterns every species followed. Fear, surrender, logic. But humans didn't fit. They weren't running. They weren't following the rules of the universe the way others had. And that confused it. Bonner's voice was strained. Captain, we need to go. Now. Ross forced himself to look away from the shifting abyss outside. Athena, are the engines responding? A long pause. Then the AI's voice crackled, distorted. Captain, I am experiencing interference. It wasn't interference. It was inside the ship. A sharp gasp came from the navigation officer. He was staring at his own hands, but they weren't his hands anymore. They were shifting, melting like wax, fingers twisting into impossible shapes. He let out a strangled cry, shaking violently, as if his body was forgetting how to exist. Then, suddenly, he was gone. Not dead, not vaporized, just erased, as if he had never been there at all. The crew panicked. What the hell was that? Where did he go? Ross gritted his teeth. The thing wasn't attacking. It was correcting. Humans weren't supposed to be here. Their existence broke its understanding of reality, and so it was trying to fix the mistake. Ross grabbed the comm panel. Athena, override all safeties. I don't care what it takes. Give me engines. For a moment, only static replied. Then, in a voice far too human for an AI, Athena whispered, "It is inside me." The ship lurched. The walls began to stretch, the floor bending under their feet. Space itself was losing shape. The corridor beyond the bridge no longer led to the same place. It bent into itself, shifting, twisting, defying logic. Bonner drew his sidearm out of instinct, even though they all knew bullets meant nothing here. But instincts were all they had left. Then the whispers became something worse. They became voices. Not alien voices. Human voices. Ross's own voice echoed from the speakers. Turn back. It's too late. We were never supposed to come here. The weapons officer's voice followed, but she was already dead. You don't belong. You don't belong. You don't. The voices layered, twisted, repeated in an endless, nightmarish loop. They weren't recordings. They were possibilities, versions of themselves that had already lost. Ross refused to accept that. Bonner, he growled. Backup command overrides. Now. Bonner moved fast, fingers flying over the emergency controls. The ship groaned. Metal twisted. The engines roared to life. Ross slammed his fist on the console. Athena, if you can hear me, burn everything we've got. For a brief second, silence. Then, boom. The HSS Vengeance ignited every thruster at once, a blinding explosion of energy ripping through the void. The force hurled them forward, tearing them out of the nightmare's grasp. The thing did not follow. It did not chase. It simply stared, as if watching something impossible. Then, without a sound, it vanished. Everything snapped back to normal. The screens flickered, the ship stabilized, and the corridors were as they should be. But the navigation officer was still gone. No body, no trace, as if he had never been born. The crew sat in stunned silence, hearts pounding. Ross exhaled shakily. Status. Athena's voice returned. Normal, but quieter. We have left the anomaly. Systems stabilizing. Bonner wiped sweat from his brow. What? The hell just happened? Ross stared into the blackness behind them. They had faced something beyond comprehension, something that should have erased them. But it didn't. Because it couldn't. Not yet. Bonner's voice was grim. We pissed it off. Ross nodded. We did. And whatever it wasn't done with them. Not even close. The HSS Vengeance floated in the vast emptiness of space, its hull scarred, its systems barely holding together. The nightmare was behind them, at least for now. But the silence that followed was worse. It felt unnatural, like the universe itself was waiting. Captain Ross sat in the command chair, gripping the armrests as if letting go would send him spiraling into the abyss. The crew was shaken, pale-faced, their hands trembling over the controls. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. Bonner finally broke the silence. That thing, he whispered. We weren't supposed to survive, were we? Ross didn't answer. Because Bonner was right. Whatever they had encountered, it had never lost before. Every species before them had been erased, wiped from existence as if they had never been. But humanity had survived. Somehow, some way, they had broken the pattern. And now, the question wasn't how they survived. It was why. Ross exhaled, forcing himself to think. His mind felt sluggish, weighed down by the horror they had just escaped. But fear wouldn't get them answers, only action would. Athena, he said finally, his voice hoarse. What do we know? The ship's ag responded, her voice quieter than usual. Our logs contain fragmented data. The entity's energy signatures do not match any known life forms or technology. A pause. Captain, I am detecting something unusual. Ross sat forward. Explain. Athena hesitated. The entity did not attack. It observed. Analyzed. It interacted with our perception of reality. But it did not attempt to destroy us in a conventional manner. Bonner frowned. That's not how I remember it. It erased Evans right in front of us. Ross's fingers tapped against the armrest. No, he muttered. It didn't kill them. Bonner turned. Then where the hell did he go? Ross's stomach twisted. He was erased. Same thing. No, Ross said firmly. Not the same thing. Killing something leaves a body, a trace, a record of existence. But Evans, he swallowed. It's like he was never born. The weight of his own words sent a chill down his spine. Bonner stared at him. So what are you saying? That thing doesn't kill people. It removes them from time itself. Ross didn't answer, because he didn't know. What he did know was that this wasn't over. They needed answers. Athena, Ross said, run a deep scan of our systems. Look for anything out of place. The AI complied, and the seconds stretched into an eternity. Every breath felt loud in the silent bridge. Then, finally, Captain, Athena said, I have found something. Ross's pulse quickened. Go on. There are files in our database that should not exist. Bonner frowned. What kind of files? Athena hesitated. They contain mission reports, ship logs, personal records. Ross narrowed his eyes. So, Athena's voice was quieter now. Captain, they are from HSS Vengeance, from our ship, but they do not belong to us. The words sent a cold shiver through the room. Bonner leaned forward. Wait, you're saying there are records from another Vengeance? Not just one. Athena whispered. Hundreds. The bridge fell into stunned silence. Ross's hands curled into fists. Show me. The screens flickered. Lines of text scrolled across, each log marked with a date that did not exist. Missions they had never undertaken. Battles they had never fought. And yet each one felt real. Ross's throat tightened as he read a report with his own name attached. Captain Ross of the HSS Vengeance. Mission failed. Crew lost. The entity has consumed us. Humanity's fate is sealed. The next log was the same. And the next. And the next. Over and over again. The records told the same story. The Vengeance entered the Forbidden Zone. The crew encountered the entity. They were erased. Again and again, hundreds of times. Bonner stepped back. This has to be some kind of mistake. Athena's voice was almost human in its fear. It is not a mistake. The data is real. Ross's mind raced. His thoughts felt like broken glass, scattered and sharp. If these logs were real, if they weren't the first Vengeance to make it this far, then that meant. Ross's breath caught. We've done this before. Bonner's eyes widened. Ross turned to the screen, scrolling through the endless logs. Every time we've come here, every time we've faced that thing, and every time we've lost. Bonner clenched his fists, but not this time. Ross stared at the last log, the one that belonged to them. The last Vengeance. He swallowed hard. Not yet. Bonner took a step forward. So why are we still here? Why aren't we erased like the others? Ross's jaw tightened. Because we did something different. They had broken the cycle. Ross turned back to Athena. Cross-reference every log. What did we do this time that none of the others did? The AI processed the request in silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Captain, this iteration of the HSS Vengeance is the first to have attempted unpredictable movement patterns. Ross's pulse spiked. That was it. Every previous version of them had tried to fight the entity like a normal enemy. But this time, they had done something new. They had moved randomly. They had been chaotic. They had been human. Bonner exhaled sharply. That's why it didn't erase us. Ross nodded. It couldn't understand us. And if it couldn't understand them, it couldn't unmake them. For the first time since entering the Forbidden Zone, Ross felt something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. Bonner ran a hand over his face. So what now? Ross straightened. His mind was no longer clouded by fear. We stop running, he said. We stop being afraid. The crew turned to look at him. Ross's eyes burned with determination. We've spent this whole time trying to escape. But what if we're not supposed to? What if the only way to win is to face it head-on? Bonner swallowed. You're talking about fighting something that doesn't even exist in normal reality. Ross's lips curled into a grim smile. Then we make it exist. For the first time in history, humanity had a chance to fight back. And this time, they weren't going to lose. The HSS Vengeance drifted in the abyss, surrounded by a darkness that was not just the absence of light. It was something alive, something watching. The crew felt it pressing against their minds, whispering just beyond the edge of reality. Ross stood at the center of the bridge, his jaw clenched, his heart pounded, but his hands were steady. This was it, the final stand. Bonner's voice was tight. Captain, we can still turn back. Ross shook his head. No. If we run, we die. If we fight, at least we have a chance. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen what this thing could do. It didn't kill. It erased. Entire species had been consumed by it, never to be remembered. Every logical instinct told them to flee. But logic had never been humanity's greatest strength. Defiance was. Ross exhaled. We survived because we're unpredictable. That's our only advantage. And we're about to use it. Athena, the ship's AI, spoke softly. Captain, it is returning. The screens flickered. The ship trembled. A low hum vibrated through the hull, a sound from nowhere and everywhere. Then, space itself ripped apart. A shape emerged from the void, shifting and impossible to define. It had no single form, no true presence. It was a thought that had become real. The crew felt it more than they saw it. Their minds recoiled, trying to make sense of something that should not exist. Ross tightened his grip on the armrest. Target it. Bonner hesitated. With what? Ross's eyes burned with determination. With everything. The ship's weapons flared to life. Cannons hummed. Torpedoes locked on, and the energy reactors surged to full power. Every gun on the Vengeance turned toward the Nightmare. For the first time in history, humanity was fighting back. Ross gave the order. Fire. The void exploded. Missiles screamed through the darkness. Energy blasts tore through the shifting form, and torpedoes detonated with the force of collapsing stars. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like they had done it. Then, the Nightmare moved. It didn't dodge. It didn't block. It simply changed. Space folded around it. Weapons fire vanished before impact. Reality itself rewrote to erase the attack, as if it had never happened. Bonner's voice was raw. It's not working. Ross gritted his teeth. He had expected this. That thing didn't fight like a normal enemy. It didn't need to. It existed outside of rules, outside of cause and effect. But so did humans. Ross turned to Athena. Prepare the drive. The AI hesitated. Captain, a blind jump in an uncharted anomaly has a 99.8% chance of catastrophic failure. Ross's lips twisted into a smirk. So there's a chance. Bonner's eyes widened. Wait, you're not seriously. Ross didn't let him finish. Jump. The ship lurched violently. Space twisted. The Nightmare entity reached for them. And suddenly, they weren't there anymore. For the first time, they had moved before it could react. The crew gasped, hands gripping consoles as the Vengeance emerged inside the anomaly itself. The space around them was wrong. Colors that shouldn't exist. Gravity shifting unpredictably. But they were still alive. And the entity, it was outside. Bonner exhaled sharply. Holy hell, it lost us. Ross didn't smile. Not yet. He turned to Athena. Charge every weapon. Divert all power to the cannons. Bonner stared. You want to shoot into a blind jump. Ross's eyes gleamed. No, I want to shoot from a blind jump. Realization dawned. Bonner let out a breathless chuckle. You're insane. Ross grinned. I'm human. The ship's systems groaned as all power redirected to the main cannon. The hull shook violently. The ship's circuits overloaded. Outside, the Nightmare hesitated. It was looking for them. Searching. Ross took a breath. He had one shot. Fire. The blast erupted. A lance of pure energy. A shot that had no location, no fixed point in space. It didn't travel. It simply was. The entity realized too late. The beam tore through it. The Nightmare screamed. Not a sound, but an idea, a presence that had never known pain before. It began to unravel. The void shook. The impossible fractured. The entity broke. And then, silence. The Vengeance jerked back into real space. The crew sucked in breath. The screens were clear. The void was empty. Bonner slowly sat down. His hands were shaking. Did we? Athena's voice was quiet. The entity is gone. Ross exhaled. His body ached. His mind screamed in exhaustion. But they had done it. For the first time in history, the Nightmare had lost. And humanity. They had won. The HSS Vengeance drifted in the silent void, battle-scared, and barely holding together. The ship's hull was cracked. Energy reserves were critical, and half the systems were running on emergency power. But despite everything, despite the impossible odds, they had won. The Nightmare was gone. The entity that had erased entire civilizations, that had wiped species from existence, as if they had never been, was no more. Humanity had done the unthinkable. They had killed the unkillable. Ross sat in his chair, staring at the empty space where the entity had once been. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened. The bridge was eerily quiet, every crew member struggling to process the impossible. Bonner was the first to speak. His voice was hoarse. So, what now? No one answered, because no one knew. For so long, The galaxy had lived in fear of the entity. For centuries, it had been the silent executioner, the unseen force that wiped out any species unfortunate enough to cross its path. And now it was gone. Ross exhaled slowly. Athena. Status report. The AI's voice was softer than usual. Primary weapons depleted. Hull integrity at 37%. Life support stable but compromised. A pause. Then, almost reverently, "Captain, we are alone." The words settled over them like a heavy fog. No more whispers from the void. No more distortions in space. No more presence. Bonner let out a breathless laugh. "Dan." He ran a hand over his face. "We actually did it." Ross nodded. "We did." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the comms console beeped. A faint signal. Weak, but real. Ross frowned. "Athena." The AI processed the signal. "Captain, it is a distress call." Bonner raised an eyebrow. "From who?" Athena hesitated. "Unknown. The transmission contains a language pattern, consistent with multiple extinct civilizations." The bridge went cold. Ross's eyes widened. "Play it." A moment of static. Then, a voice. Weak, desperate, alive. The language shifted, broken pieces of dozens of different dialects stitched together. Words that had never been spoken in the same tongue before, now fused into one desperate plea. "Is someone there? Please. Anyone. We need help." The crew froze. Bonner's mouth went dry. "That's not possible." Athena's voice was barely above a whisper. "Captain, the entity erased species from existence. But if it is truly gone..." Ross leaned forward, heart hammering. "Then what it erased might be coming back." A shiver ran through the crew. Bonner swallowed. "Are we talking about ghosts, or..." Athena interrupted. "Captain, I am detecting multiple anomalies across the galaxy. Spatial distortions where once there was nothing." A pause. "Captain, I believe lost civilizations are returning." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Ross closed his eyes. The weight of the moment settled over him. Humanity had done more than survive. They had broken the chains. For centuries, the galaxy had been trapped in a cycle of fear, watching helplessly as entire species vanished without a trace. No one had ever fought back. No one had even tried. Until now. Ross opened his eyes, a new fire burning in them. "Athena, can you locate the source of the distress signal?" "Affirmative." "Then set a course." Bonner stared. "We're going after them." Ross looked at him. Really looked at him. The human race had always been the underdog. The weak ones. The reckless ones. The ones too stubborn to know when to quit. And now, they were something new. They had faced the thing that even the stars feared. And they had won. Ross stood, his voice steady. Humanity has spent its whole existence surviving. He looked around at his crew. But today we become something more. The engines of the vengeance roared to life. Ross's eyes gleamed. Today we become the hunters.